Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson, World Alternative Media here, and we are here in Acapulco, Mexico for Anarchapulco 2017, and I am joined by Sterlin Lujan. And can you kind of give our audience a bit of a inside look at what you do and why you do it?
Sure, absolutely. I run the Psychologic-Anarchist Facebook page. I run the Psychologic-Anarchist website, and I also have my personal web page, which is just Sterlin Lujan. And I also have a Compassionate Anarchy group that has about 5,000 members now, that has grown exponentially. And the main thing that I do is try to promote anarchism through this idea of relational anarchy. And relational anarchy is this idea that if we can make connections with people, if we can leverage empathy and compassion, that it's those factors that will actually help us push toward an anarchist society. Right? Because a lot of times, or especially traditionally, anarchism has been either considered a legal philosophy or a moralistic philosophy, but I characterize it as a psychological philosophy. And the idea there is that anarchism as a term is really apolitical, right? Whenever we say that we don't want a ruler, we're actually describing a relationship that we want to have with other people, right?
Absolutely.
So you and I we're talking right now, we've made connections, Josh, we have a mutual understanding of one another.
Absolutely.
So that relationship that we have is apolitical because there's no violence involved, and we just have that mutual understanding. And it's that relationship that we have that we can also work in society at large in order to try to build the anarchistic society that we want.
Well, that's excellent. And so many people in the anarchist movement, we have different ways of communicating to people. We have different ways of getting that message out and trying to convince others that, this is a path to prosperity. This is a moral path to prosperity, and not just that, it's a practical path to prosperity as well. And of course, we get it across in different ways. And I was just wondering, say there was someone who is a conservative that's watching. What would you tell them, basically, just in the basics, what would you tell them to convince them that, you know what, you are against most of the government, right? You don't agree with most of the state. Why are you clinging on to that last little bit? Why not become an anarchist? What would you do, or what would you say to convince them?
Sure. I think the first thing that I would do, Josh, is really try to find the common ground with the conservative. And I probably have more common ground with the conservative because my economic principles are generally very right-leaning.
Yeah.
I'm a lover of property norms and the propertarian ethic. So I would start at that point. I would make common ground with the individual. I would have a conversation with them about anarchism and what anarchism is. And I would also pay attention to their communication. I would look at their body language. And this is, of course, granted if we're speaking in person, which I'm assuming we are. I would pay attention to their body language and their form of communication, and I would make a determination about how I want to proceed in that conversation. If I can tell they're getting triggered, if they're getting anxiety, if they're fidgeting around, I would want to back off a little bit. I wouldn't want to be as aggressive or as hostile or even as assertive in that particular conversation, because I wouldn't want to trigger them even more. Because what happens when you trigger somebody, what happens when they get really upset and adrenaline fueled, the brain actually releases a neurohormone called cortisol, and cortisol is a stress hormone that at high enough levels can actually impair our ability to learn. So over a long period of time, it can actually also damage protein synthesis in the brain, which is tantamount to brain damage in a traumatic sort of way. It's not something that can't be repaired, but it is obviously problematic. So if I was relating to anybody, in the sense of a conservative, I would just try to connect with them, find that common ground, talk about the things that they're interested in, and then sort of move slowly into anarchism, talk about that. And usually the reception that I have is pretty powerful, and I can generally find common ground with either conservatives or leftists if we use these relational tactics, if we use things like nonviolent communication. And we could talk more about that here if you want, but that's the basic.
Absolutely. Well, isn't it one of the bases of becoming an anarchist to be uncomfortable and to kind of question your reality? Because of course it is uncomfortable for people who have a set viewpoint to change that 360, because I think we talked a bit last night during the meet and greet here about when we are questioning things, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable when for our entire life we believe something and then we have to admit to ourselves that it's wrong and that we were wrong all along. And I think that is one of the great things about becoming an anarchist, is that we all have that moment where it clicks in our head. And why not go all the way, right? Why not throw away any leftovers or hang-ons about, even at a libertarian angle from a political minarchist scale. I mean, I was a libertarian for a long time before I became an anarchist.
Right.
And I kind of questioned myself. I was so sure of this, but I was wrong. And it's part of that mentality. You have to get to the point where you admit that you're wrong about something. So how do you get past that kind of uncomfortable, jump where you go from one thing to another? Because it is difficult to question your entire viewpoint.
Right. I think to answer this question, it really depends on the individual. Different individuals have different experiences,
Sure. Different
interactions with people, different, I guess, when it comes to just exploring the world, they enter into different situations that inevitably will push them in that direction. So I think that it really depends on the person. I can speak from personal experience how it happened with me. I decided that I wanted to try MDMA or ecstasy at one point in time, and after I used this compound, I had what the psychologists refer to as a quantum personality change or a quantum personality shift, and that just means that my personality literally changed overnight. Who I was at that point in time suddenly became completely different after the MDMA experience. And as I was coming up on the MDMA experience, I had this mantra, or this cone that I kept repeating to myself, and I kept repeating to myself, I'm a lot smarter than I originally thought I am. I'm a lot smarter than I originally thought I am, because I had dealt with all these past issues where maybe I felt downtrodden or didn't feel like I was as intelligent as I actually was. So it was that MDMA experience that allowed me to start thinking and questioning. Of course, at that point I started questioning the government. I started looking at things from a different angle, and I started wondering, why can't I be free? Why is this compound that I took that changed my life an evil and bad thing? So that's one way. Maybe there's a psychedelic experience that will help awaken people. Maybe it's something as simple as reading a book. Like, I also read Ron Paul's stuff in 2009, and his stuff was instrumental in help pushing me down. So it's about reading books. It's about getting that direct experience with others. It's about having conversations with people. So there's a multitude of factors that really coalesce to help bring a person into anarchism proper.
Absolutely. And just going from that to voluntarism and the idea that it's basically the most comfortable way to live considering different ideologies. So for example, in a volunteer society, you can have your commune over here, you could have your little socialist society over here, you can have your conservative society over here, as long as you don't force people to live in it, and people can opt out under the private contract, of course. And I feel like there's no other ideology out there that allows for everyone to have their way, as long as they're not enforcing their rule on other people. And I mean, what do you think about this as kind of a way to get people to understand anarchy, is that we're not forcing you to do anything. We're literally saying you have your ideology and you're allowed to have that ideology and you can do whatever you want with it. Just, don't infringe on our individual liberties.
Right. Yeah, and I'm right along the same lines with you. I think that it's very possible and it's very in line with anarchist principles. This idea that a multitude of different kinds of people, different types of cultures, and different types of societies, even people who believe in communitarian property, communes, I think as long as we have a mutual understanding that we're able to connect in a certain way, then though we can all coexist in the same environment sans the state. Yeah, so I don't think there's any real impediment to this idea of everybody sort of living together and being able to relate. It all has to do with how we communicate with one another and how we're able to resolve our problems. And that's one of the reasons why I also advocate nonviolent communication as a way to engage in conflict resolution for any kind of economic differences that do crop up between people. And this is one of the really tragic things that I tend to talk about quite a bit recently. We've had this splintering off in anarchist circles where there's this sort of this alt-right movement that's taken shape, and some anarchists have started to shift gears, and it really, they look like they're defending Trump. Of course, they defend this idea as a descriptive analysis where they're agreeing with so it's sort of a quasi defense of Trump and his policies. And a big aspect of that is just fight the left. They have this what I call fight mentality. Fight the left, fight the left, fight the left. And then there's this condemnation as leftists as just a pejorative term, but everybody who they paint as a leftist is just automatically evil, and that right there is what I call the breakdown of communication. That's the breakdown of connection, and that is just a recipe for absolute disaster and an inability for us to come together as individuals and build the anarchist societies and cultures that we want to live in.
Well, what do you attribute that to? I mean, we have seen a major divide in the anarchist community. While there's more anarchists than ever before, at the same time, we've seen so many people that pragmatism can be a good thing to a certain extent, but when we see it go from people who are so ideologically sound, and then they see something that seems somewhat more comfortable to them because
Right.
they say, well, this is better than what we had, which is a legitimate point, but it's not the end all, right? And what do you attribute this kind of mentality of this shift to supporting people like Trump despite being a so-called anarchist?
Right. I think one of the big factors here is this notion of fear that really, and a lot of people have talked about this. Jeff has talked about this. I remember Larkin Rose, I think, saying something about this too. But a lot of this sudden shift into the alt-right is a reaction against the rise of really hardcore identity politics. It's the rise of some aspects of leftism that we would certainly say could be dangerous. So and they are definitely not immune from scrutiny as well. And also this sort of alarmist sentiment that Trump and government in general is starting to engender in order to create this divide and conquer mentality in order to keep people. I always said that if one thing is going to try to split anarchists up, it would be a very charismatic and sociopathic ruler who would come into the fray and appeal to certain sensibilities, appeal to certain amount of fear in order to cause those splits and cause those divides. So I think that's one of the things that the Trump administration has done, that the fervor of the election has really caused. And what was it? There was a quote by H.L. Mencken that sort of summed this up. He said something along, and I'm going to paraphrase, something along the lines that if one of the cornerstones of government is to raise the alarms of fear and create as many number of hobgoblins as they can in order to keep everyone like hyper vigilant and divided.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it is something that a lot of anarchists look favorably on for the example of perhaps looking at Trump is getting rid of 2 regulations to everyone that he puts in, but he's still putting that one in. Or, when he's talking about using executive orders to abolish certain parts of the state, but all the while there's a Treasury Secretary Mnuchin carrying that on. Then there's the National Security Council. It's basically the same thing, answer to the CFR, the Trilateral Commission. So nothing's really changed, but on the surface, it seems like things are changing, but it really isn't, and I think that gets a lot of people's attention and brings them over. But just finishing up, why do you think it's so important for us here to be at Anarchapulco and talk with our fellow anarchists?
This conference is absolutely amazing, and the reason that we should be here to do this is not just to interact with our fellow anarchists so that we can get an understanding of where each other are coming from and sort of the shared vision that we each have as far as how we can continue to push anarchism into the future. But it's also a way to start promoting ourselves to more aspects of the public, because this is a very high-profile location. It's a very high-profile convention. There's a lot of high-profile names here, so it's all of this combination of all of these factors that will also help get more people involved with anarchism, start making them question, well, wow, this is actually something that's happening. This is part of what you would refer to as a paradigm shift, where things are really looking to change. So I'm absolutely glad to be here. I was glad to be invited to speak. It's a really honorable thing. Yeah, this wouldn't have happened a few years ago. And when you're having a drink with G. Edward Griffin and Jeff Berwick and Luke Rudowski, Dan Dixon, all these amazing people, Roger Ver, and then yourself, it's just an amazing event. And I really hope more people come out next year. And it's growing every year, so that's a good side of it. A lot of anarchists out there, a lot of people changing, and it's a beautiful thing. So thank you very much for talking with us. Absolutely, yes, sir, Josh. Thank you. This was a pleasure. Absolutely. This is Josh Sigurdson with Sterlin Lujan, signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.